Thanks. I'm going to draw together some of what my colleagues today have said and then some of what we heard yesterday, especially in the session on climate. I'm going to talk briefly, I think, about kind of the underlying, kind of essence and characteristics of what we call the global nuclear order. And then I'm going to try to explore what I think are some of the, again, deeper causes of the disorder that my colleagues have talked about, and then briefly suggest some things that can be done that kind of build on or add to what they had talked about. Michael, began by talking about, in essence, at least one of the pillars of what became a global nuclear order after 1945. And he talked about how remarkable it is that nuclear weapons hadn't been detonated in anger against targets since 1945. And I think that's the essence of the accomplishment of the nuclear order. But there were additional facets to it. There was a tremendous worry that nuclear weapons would proliferate to other countries. So famously, President Kennedy's administration, President Kennedy was briefed that 25 countries would acquire nuclear weapons very quickly, very soon, if things continued as they would. And so for a variety of reasons, particularly the US and the Soviet Union cooperated to create the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. And that was negotiated finally in 1968. And basically since then, since that treaty was done and entered into force in 1970, there's only been one country that signed the treaty, then cheated on it and acquired nuclear weapons, and that's North Korea. It's quite a remarkable achievement if you think about international treaties, you think about anything, you think about domestic legislation and crime, and to have, that rate, that small rate of violation, that somebody gets away with is quite remarkable. And so that was another element of this global nuclear order. And then the third element of it was peaceful cooperation in atomic energy. So if you think about it, and I'm going to come to this later, because today nuclear energy isn't very attractive except in a few non-market societies or economies. But there are lots of, I should know how many nuclear power plants in the world, but it's around 450 thereabouts. And in many countries, and that operation has gone relatively, has gone very well in terms of people cheating and building nuclear weapons out of those civilian nuclear programs. And that was another part of this nuclear order that was created. And I guess what I want to say about it, it's been a remarkable success, and it's what was key to it is it's built on reliable reciprocity. That's an expression that I borrowed from Lauren Berlant, who is she's like a literary theorist at the University of Chicago that I'd never heard of until 2 weeks ago, and then I checked out a book that she wrote, and a lot of it's hard to read, but then there's some really brilliant stuff in it too that I can't understand. And one of these, and I used to talk about sustainable reciprocity, but she has reliable reciprocity, which is alliterative, and it's just great. So I stole it, and I'll quit footnoting it, hereafter. But that's what it was built upon. That if you restrain yourself, if the weapon states restrain themselves, if they agree to work towards nuclear disarmament, and others restrain themselves from acquiring nuclear weapons, and you play by the rules, everybody does better through that kind of reciprocity. And it's some of what we talked about yesterday and other elements of multilateralism. It's central to multilateralism. And it's key to the nuclear order working. As I said, the Nonproliferation Treaty was the essence of it, and so here I'll borrow from something Kevin Rudd said last night about the UN, which was what he said, look, if the UN didn't exist, we'd have to invent something like it. Well, if the Nonproliferation Treaty didn't exist, we'd have to invent something like it, except today it would be much, much harder to invent and get international subscription for than it was then. So in many ways, it's all the more important to defend and to invest in restoring. And the last point to, again, set the stage about order and how important the order is, and here I'm picking up on something Professor Jan said, which is, look at how we're worried about artificial intelligence today. Cyber more broadly, but artificial intelligence especially has people very concerned, whether it's automated weapons, aircraft, everything people are worried about, especially the international dimension. And there is no order there. There's no domestic regulation, there's no understanding of liability domestically. Internationally, they haven't even begun discussions of it. And so when you juxtapose that kind of nascent stage of technology burgeoning, lots of concern about it, there's a sense that it needs to be ordered. No one has the slightest idea how it's going to be done. Well, that was kind of where nuclear began in 1945. And so it's quite remarkable how quickly and successfully an order was built in that domain. And we should hope that we can figure out how to do as well with AI and some of these technologies. But if that's going to be the case, I think we're going to have to go back to the fundamental principles of reliable reciprocity, quid pro quos, and creating incentives for people to comply. So that leads me to the second section, which is my sense that what we're experiencing and a lot of the problems that people here talked about, whether it's the INF Treaty being first violated and then withdrawn from, the absence of arms control, the DPRK challenge, the Iran undoing, there's a long list, the arms race. I think what's happening is you have disinvestment from this nuclear order and disinvestment from at least two blocks of country. And I'll suggest there are four factors driving it. So the US and I would say Russia are disinvesting from that nuclear order for somewhat similar reasons. The US disinvestment is really intensified and made explicit by John Bolton and President Trump. But really, John Bolton makes it explicit. And the idea is, look, there aren't many threats of proliferation anymore. All right? Like, name the country that we're now worried about will acquire nuclear weapons. The one that people nominate is Saudi Arabia. Well, first of all, from the Bush administration, that isn't the biggest problem in the world. So then the next thing is, well, okay, so tell me a bad guy who's going to get nuclear weapons now. And the answer of the Trump administration and John Bolton is, we'll handle that ourselves, militarily. So we don't need all these rules and this rigmarole and all these bargains and concessions and trade-offs. Screw it. If somebody does it, we'll remove them. And that was basically the Bush administration strategy in 2002 with the axis of evil. That's the strategy that led to the invasion of Iraq. And Iran was supposed to be next, or North Korea. And so the approach is it's like the NRA says about arms control. The problem isn't arms. It's not nuclear arms. The problem is bad guys with nuclear arms. And so the strategy is not to control the arms, it's to get rid of the bad guys. And so it's a coherent theory that leads to disinvestment from that kind of order. And I think Russia's disinvesting for somewhat related reasons. Russia's more concerned about selling nuclear power plants, about making deals in countries that may be seeking to acquire nuclear energy. And if there's a worry that those countries like Saudi Arabia may seek to acquire nuclear weapons, we'll deal with that later, or that'll be the US's problem or somebody else's problem. But it's not the first concern. And beyond sales, the bigger concern is contesting and countering the US and trying to play off challenges with other countries as a way to gain leverage over the US. I think the second factor causing disinvestment is that nuclear energy is no longer attractive. It's not attractive enough for developing countries to make them go, gee, I want nuclear energy so badly that I'll do whatever these people are telling me to do in terms of export controls, not acquiring nuclear weapons, behaving well so that I can get nuclear energy. Look at it now, and it's after Fukushima especially, but also just prices. It's just not a great investment. China's the only country really that's got a kind of still a burgeoning nuclear energy program. And so I think that changes the dynamic within the nuclear order. The third kind of disinvesting dynamic is that the disadvantaged participants in this order, ones that feel they're victims, are primarily the non-nuclear weapon states. The countries in South America, Africa, and in parts of Asia that feel they get no benefit from nuclear deterrence. All right? So, unlike our NATO ally, U.S. NATO allies, unlike Russia, these countries go, look, we don't face threats for which nuclear deterrence is relevant. These countries aren't going to defend us. And yet, if they have a big nuclear war, we get screwed. Like, our food supply is going to be endangered. We're going to be dealing with the global chaos that will come of that. And so they say, we want to morally protest this. We want to disinvest and challenge this system. And so they basically led negotiation 2 years ago of a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. All right? Frustrated with the Nonproliferation Treaty, feeling that the nuclear weapon states are never going to get rid of nuclear weapons, they said, the hell with it. We'll negotiate a separate treaty that just says ban them, prohibit them, period. It doesn't matter if it's not binding on any of the weapon states. We'll make our stand on there, and we're less interested now in nonproliferation. I think the fourth driver of this disinvestment is something that we've been talking about, which is new technology. So whether it's artificial intelligence, hypersonic conventional weapons that Nikolai talked about, other kinds of systems, people are kind of going, those are the new threats that we really got to be worried about. Nuclear is kind of the old. It's not clear how nuclear arms control and the existing systems going to deal with these new technologies. So let's focus on the new technologies and spend less time and energy on the old ones. So from different directions, you've got some people arguing from like a security narrative saying they're disinvesting, others from a moral or humanitarian narrative saying they're disinvesting from this order. And all of that is compounded by the lack of leadership from the U.S. because orders basically, whether they're trade, as we talked about yesterday, or climate and nuclear, you need at least like one of the biggest powers to try to drive it. Preferably, you'd have two. So the nuclear order was built by the U.S. and the Soviet Union. We talked yesterday, Todd talked about you can't do climate without the U.S. and China. I would argue, that both of those things are true. And on the nuclear, we're going to have the U.S., Russia, and China going forward. And if you don't have that cooperation, you can't basically, restore the order. So that leads to what can we do about it? In my mind, the first thing is something that none of my colleagues think about and that Washington doesn't think about at all, except maybe President Trump. And this is a serious comment and kind of praise of him. It's not praise, but it's an accent. But how do you get Russia off the sanctions track? So Russia had a bunch of sanctions imposed, deservedly in my view, for what it did in Ukraine. But the problem with sanctions is once you've applied them, you've kind of defeated the purpose. The behavior that you are trying to change, doesn't work. So in Russia's case, how do we move forward? How does the world move forward? Russia's never giving back Crimea. Never's a long time. It's not clear when and why Russia would give back Crimea. It's still meddling in Ukraine. The sanctions are there. Putin is really pissed off about it. He wants those sanctions removed. There's no dialogue or even thinking in the West how to remove the sanctions. And so if you want to get Russia to come back in and play on these other issues, how do you motivate them to do that? Seems to me a vital issue that no one's really thinking about. And then with China, how do you deal with the territorial aggrandizement that has people so concerned in the South China Sea? So the building of islands out of rock outcroppings or adding of runways onto things that alarm ASEAN states, Japan, the U.S., and others. We have to deal with and China's concerned about what U.S. intentions are in Taiwan. If you don't address those underlying issues, it seems to me it's very hard to then get into a serious discussion about strategic stability and tempering or controlling the military, including the nuclear competition. But again, we don't have a dialogue with China on strategic stability. We're not engaged in that process. And that was a problem before the Trump administration, and it's been exacerbated by Trump. So I've got a list of other things that are very similar to what came up in the climate discussion about accountability and equity. So they're larger things than arms control, but it seems to me if we don't address those, the multilateral order around nuclear weapons is going to continue to experience disinvestment. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you.